A teacher? That's not a real career. My father said those words at the dinner table, loud enough for every single guest to hear. 30 people went silent. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. And my husband, the man he was talking about, was sitting right there. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply set his fork down, looked at my father for a moment, and said absolutely nothing. But what happened 2 days later is something my father never saw coming. Because the same man he mocked for babysitting kids for pennies would soon be standing in a room filled with hundreds of people, being honored for something my father could never buy, no matter how much money he had. And the moment my father realized the truth was the first time in his 68 years that he truly had nothing left to say. Now, before I tell you how that happened, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone judge another person only to realize later they were completely wrong? If you enjoy powerful real-life stories about family respect and the quiet kind of justice that takes time but always arrives, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That way, if life pulls you away before the end of this story, you'll be able to come back and finish it later. Because trust me, the moment that happened 2 days after this dinner is something nobody in that room will ever forget. And strangely enough, it all started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. 5 years. That's how long it had been since I last spoke to my parents. 5 years of silence. 5 birthdays. 5 Christmases. And not a single phone call. Not from my father. Not from my mother. The last time we spoke was the night I told them I was marrying Daniel. My father didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He simply stood in the middle of his kitchen, looked at me, and said something colder than anger. If you marry that school teacher, don't come back here again. And just like that, the door closed. I chose Daniel, and for 5 years, that choice meant losing my family. But life has a strange way of circling back to the places we thought we'd left behind. Because one Tuesday evening, while I was helping my daughter wash the paint off her hands after preschool, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen, and for a second, I thought I was imagining things. The name said, Mom. No emoji, no photo, just the word Mom, sitting there like a ghost from another life. My first instinct was to ignore it. After all, 5 years is a long time to be silent. But my daughter Emma looked up at me with those wide, curious eyes children have when they sense something unusual. Mommy, why are you staring at your phone like that? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I picked it up, and I answered, Hello. For a moment, there was nothing but breathing on the other end of the line. Then my mother spoke. Katie, honey, it's been a long time. Her voice sounded older than I remembered, softer too. I know, I said quietly. There was another pause, the kind filled with things neither person knows how to say. Finally, she cleared her throat. Your father and I are having our 40th anniversary next weekend. A family dinner, some neighbors, a few relatives. I didn't say anything. My daughter Emma had already moved on, building a crooked tower of blocks on the living room floor. My mother continued carefully. We thought, maybe you and Daniel might come. There it was, 5 years of silence. And suddenly, an invitation. I leaned against the kitchen counter, feeling the weight of the moment. You remember what Dad said the last time we spoke? I said. My mother exhaled slowly. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. I almost laughed. People say that sometimes, when they know exactly what someone meant. But then she said something that caught me off guard. He asks about you, Katie. That surprised me. My father was not a man who asked questions. He was a man who made decisions. Still, my mother continued. And about Emma, my heart skipped. Emma was 4 years old, and my parents had never met her, never held her, never even seen a picture. Your father saw her name on your social media page, my mother said quietly. He said, she must look like you. For a moment, the kitchen felt very still, because suddenly, this wasn't just about my parents. It was about a little girl who didn't even know she had grandparents. I'll think about it, I finally said. That's all I ask, my mother replied quickly. We hung up a few seconds later. I stood there holding the phone, staring at the dark screen. Then I heard the sound of papers rustling behind me. Daniel was sitting at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of student essays. He looked up. Everything okay? I walked over and sat down across from him. My mom called. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That was the kind of news that deserved a moment of silence. What did she want? He asked gently. They're having an anniversary dinner next weekend. She wants us to come. Daniel didn't react immediately. Instead, he folded one of the essays closed, set his red pen down, and looked at me the way he always did when something mattered. Carefully. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know, I admitted. I glanced toward the living room, where Emma was now singing quietly to herself while she stacked blocks. She's 4, Daniel, I said softly. She's never met them. Daniel followed my gaze. Emma's laugh drifted through the room like sunlight. After a moment, he nodded. If you want her to meet them, he said, then we go. You're sure? He smiled faintly. Katie, I teach teenagers for a living. He picked up another essay and flipped it open. I've handled worse than a tense family dinner. I laughed, but something in his tone made me look at him more closely, because sitting beside the stack of papers was a thick, white envelope, official-looking, stamped with the seal of the county school district. I pointed at it. What's that? Daniel glanced down at the envelope, then casually slid it beneath the pile of essays. Oh, nothing important, he said. Just school stuff. I nodded slowly. At the time, I believed him. But looking back now, that envelope sitting quietly under those papers was the beginning of everything that would happen 2 days later. And if I had known what was inside it, I might have understood why my husband was so calm when my father decided to humiliate him in front of 30 people. The drive to my parents' town took a little over 3 hours. 3 quiet hours of highway, radio music, and my daughter asking every 20 minutes if we were almost there. Emma had fallen asleep halfway through the trip, her small head resting against the window. Daniel kept one hand lightly on the steering wheel, the other resting on the console between us. Neither of us talked much. Some silences feel uncomfortable. This one felt cautious, like we were both walking towards something we couldn't quite see yet. By the time we reached the town where I grew up, the sun was already starting to sink low behind the rows of oak trees. Everything looked exactly the same. The same diner on the corner, the same gas station, even the same faded billboard advertising fishing supplies. Small towns have a way of holding on to time. My parents' house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with old maple trees. White siding, wide front porch, the same porch swing my father had installed when I was in middle school. Emma woke up just as Daniel parked the car. Are we there? She asked sleepily. We are, I said, brushing her hair back from her face. She looked at the house curiously. Is this Grandma's house? I nodded. Yes, sweetheart. The front door opened before we even reached the steps. My mother hurried out, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at me, like she wasn't sure I was real. Then she rushed forward and wrapped her arms around me. Oh, Katie, it's so good to see you. She held on longer than I expected. When she finally pulled back, her eyes moved immediately to Emma. Well, look at you, she whispered softly. Emma hid halfway behind Daniel's leg. Daniel smiled politely and offered his hand. Good to see you again, Mrs. Whitaker. My mother shook his hand, though the smile she gave him was careful. Then a voice came from the doorway behind her. Well, look who finally decided to show up. My father, Richard Whitaker. He stepped onto the porch slowly. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, more gray in his hair. But his posture was exactly the same. Straight, confident. The posture of a man used to being the most important person in the room. His eyes moved from me to Emma, and finally to Daniel. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. The handshake lasted maybe 2 seconds. Just long enough to be polite, not long enough to be warm. Come inside, my mother said quickly. Dinner's almost ready. The house smelled like roast beef and fresh bread. For a moment, Walking through the doorway felt like stepping back into another life. The dining table was already set, 6 chairs, plates neatly arranged. My younger sister, Laura, was sitting near the window, scrolling through her phone. She jumped up when she saw me. "Katie," she pulled me into a tight hug. Then she crouched down in front of Emma. "And you must be Emma." Emma nodded shyly. Dinner started quietly enough. My mother passed dishes around the table. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans. The same meal she'd made almost every Sunday when I was growing up. For the first 15 minutes, the conversation stayed safe. Laura asked Emma about preschool. My mother asked about my job at the hospital. Even my father stayed relatively quiet, carving the roast at the head of the table. Then he looked up at Daniel. "So," he said. The word hung in the air. "You're still teaching." Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes, sir. High school history." My father leaned back slightly. He wiped his mouth with his napkin. "You know who I ran into last month?" he said, glancing at me. I already knew where this was going. Mark Sullivan. My stomach tightened. Mark Sullivan had been my college boyfriend, and my father's favorite choice for my future husband. "Runs 3 car dealerships now," my father continued casually. "Doing very well for himself." Daniel didn't react. He simply continued cutting Emma's food into small pieces. "That's good to hear," he said politely. My father smiled, but there was something sharp behind it. "Ambition," he said. "That's what builds a future." The table grew quiet. My mother quickly reached for the gravy boat. "Emma, would you like some more potatoes?" But my father wasn't finished. "You know," he continued, looking directly at Daniel now, "I've always wondered something." Daniel looked up. "What's that?" My father folded his hands on the table. "How does a man support a family on a teacher's salary?" There it was, the first crack. Daniel met his gaze calmly. "We managed just fine," he said. My father chuckled softly. Fine is a very flexible word. Laura shifted in her chair uncomfortably. My mother stared down at her plate, and suddenly, I realized something that made my chest tighten. This dinner wasn't a reunion. It was a stage, and my father had been planning the performance long before we arrived. But what I didn't realize yet was that tomorrow's anniversary dinner would have more than 30 guests, and my father already had something prepared for Daniel, something he thought would prove, once and for all, that marrying a school teacher had been the biggest mistake of my life. Saturday afternoon arrived faster than I expected. By noon, my parents' backyard looked like a small community festival. Long folding tables stretched across the lawn. White tablecloths fluttered in the breeze. Neighbors wandered through the gate, carrying pies and casseroles. Someone had set up a speaker on the porch, playing old country songs from the 70s. My father stood near the grill, greeting guests like a mayor, shaking hands during an election. The Whitaker anniversary dinner had become something bigger than a simple family gathering. By 1 o'clock, there were more than 30 people in the yard. Old neighbors, distant cousins, friends my parents had known for decades. Everyone seemed cheerful. Everyone except me. Because I kept noticing the way my father moved through the crowd, occasionally glancing toward Daniel. Not angry, not even annoyed, just waiting. As if the evening had a moment he was patiently building toward. Daniel, meanwhile, looked perfectly relaxed. Emma sat on his shoulders while he walked slowly around the yard, showing her the garden. She laughed every time he pretended to lose his balance. Watching them together always had the same effect on me. It reminded me why I chose him, even when the choice cost me everything. Eventually, everyone gathered around the long tables for dinner. Plates were filled, glasses clinked. The sound of 30 conversations blended together in a comfortable hum. For a brief moment, it almost felt like a normal family celebration. Then my father stood up. He tapped his fork lightly against his glass. The sound cut through the noise instantly. "Thank you all for coming," he began. People quieted down. He spoke about 40 years of marriage, about family, about community, the kind of speech he had given dozens of times at business dinners and town events. My father had always been good at commanding attention. But as he spoke, I noticed something. His eyes kept drifting toward our end of the table, toward Daniel. Finally, he raised his glass. "And of course," he said, smiling, "it's nice to see my daughter visiting again after all these years." A few people nodded politely. Then his gaze shifted. And Daniel, he paused. Why don't you tell everyone what you do for a living? The yard went quiet again. I felt a sudden knot tighten in my stomach. Daniel wiped his hands with his napkin and looked up calmly. I'm a high school history teacher. My father tilted his head. A teacher. He chuckled softly. Then he said the sentence that froze the entire table. So basically, you babysit teenagers for pennies. For a second, nobody moved. 30 people sitting in the warm afternoon sunlight. Completely silent. Someone's fork clinked softly against a plate. A neighbor coughed awkwardly. I felt heat rush into my face. But Daniel simply set his fork down. He folded his napkin beside his plate. Then he looked at my father. Not angrily, not defensively, just quietly, as if he had been expecting those words all along. And then he said nothing. That silence somehow made the moment even heavier, because everyone at the table knew exactly what had just happened. My father leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Now don't take it personally, he added casually. I'm just saying, some careers build a future. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say a word, a small voice spoke beside Daniel. Daddy, Emma was sitting on his lap. Her little eyebrows were knitted together in confusion. She looked around the table, then back at him. Why is Grandpa laughing at you? The question hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. No one answered. Not my father, not my mother, not a single person at that table. Because there is something about a child's honesty that makes adults suddenly uncomfortable. Daniel looked down at Emma. His expression softened immediately. Hey, sweetheart, he said gently. Do you want to go look for fireflies? Her face brightened. Really, really. He lifted her off his lap and stood up slowly. Then he looked once more at my father. Still calm, still silent. And he walked away across the yard, holding Emma's hand. Past the tables, past the banner that read Happy Anniversary, Richard and Margaret. Past the 30 guests who watched him leave, pretending to return to their food. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped. Because the worst part wasn't what my father had said. It was the silence that followed. The silence of people who knew it was wrong and chose comfort over courage. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the wooden deck. Dad, I said firmly, you owe my husband an apology. My father looked genuinely surprised. For what he asked? For humiliating him in front of everyone. He waved his hand dismissively. Oh, come on, Katie. It was just a joke. But I knew something my father didn't. Because at that exact moment, the man he had just mocked in front of 30 people was quietly standing in the backyard with our daughter, watching tiny fireflies rise from the grass. And inside Daniel's travel bag, hidden in an envelope he still hadn't told me about, was something that would make this entire dinner look very different. In less than 48 hours, that night, we didn't stay at my parents' house. Not after what happened. Daniel didn't argue with my father. He didn't demand an apology. He simply helped Emma into the car, thanked my mother for dinner, and drove away. We checked into a small roadside motel about 15 minutes outside town, the kind with a flickering neon sign and a humming ice machine outside the door. Emma fell asleep almost immediately. She had spent the entire afternoon chasing fireflies with Daniel in the yard behind the motel. Children have a way of finding joy, even on the strangest days. But once she was asleep, the silence in the room felt very different. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, loosening his tie. I leaned against the dresser, watching him. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said it. I'm sorry. He looked up. For what? For my father. Daniel shook his head gently. Katie, your father's opinions aren't your responsibility. That's not the point, I said. My daughter heard him laugh at you. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. That part bothered me. He leaned back against the headboard. I just didn't want Emma to remember something like that. The room went still again. I watched him carefully. How do you stay so calm? I finally asked. Daniel smiled faintly. 12 years of teaching teenagers, he said. You learn that reacting to every insult usually makes things worse. Then he glanced toward his travel bag, sitting on the floor. The same bag I had noticed earlier, the same one with the envelope inside. I folded my arms. "Okay," I said. "Now, you're going to tell me what's in that envelope." Daniel looked at me for a moment. Then he sighed. "Well, I guess you are going to find out eventually." He reached down and pulled the envelope from the bag. It was thick, official, the seal of the county school district stamped across the front. He handed it to me. "Open it." I slid my finger beneath the flap and unfolded the letter inside. The first line made me blink, then read it again and again. "Daniel," I whispered, "your teacher of the year." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Apparently, the letter explained everything. The Chatham County Board of Education had selected Daniel as County Teacher of the Year out of more than 200 teachers. The ceremony was scheduled for Monday afternoon at the Civic Center in Savannah, 2 days away. I looked up at him in disbelief. "When did you find out about this?" 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. "And you didn't tell me?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "I didn't want it to seem like I was trying to prove something." "Prove something to who?" He gave me a look. I didn't need him to say the name. "My father." I stared down at the letter again. There were pages of comments from students and parents. One line caught my attention. "Mr. Carter is the reason I stayed in school when I was ready to drop out." Another said, "He believed in me when nobody else did." My throat tightened. "You should have told me," I said softly. Daniel smiled. "I figured you'd find out Monday." "Monday." "Yeah." He leaned forward slightly. "One of my former students is giving a speech." "Who?" "Marcus Hill." The name sounded vaguely familiar. "Remember the kid I told you about a few years ago? The one who used to stay after school every day?" I nodded slowly. "He was living in his car," Daniel said quietly. "No family, no place to go. And you never told anyone." Daniel shrugged again. "It wasn't my story to tell. And now he's finishing medical school." I stared at him. For a long moment, I couldn't find any words. Finally, I whispered the only thing that came to mind. "My father called you a babysitter." Daniel chuckled softly. "Well, technically, I do watch teenagers all day." I shook my head. "You should have told him tonight." Daniel's expression became thoughtful. "Number. Why not?" "Because the people who truly respect what you do don't need proof." He lay back against the pillow. "And the people who don't respect it?" He shrugged. "A letter won't change their minds." I looked down at the envelope again. The heavy official paper. The embossed seal. Suddenly, something occurred to me. "Wait." I sat up straighter. "The ceremony. It's Monday." "Yeah." "What time?" 2 in the afternoon. A slow realization spread through my mind. Because my parents' town was less than 2 hours from Savannah, which meant if someone happened to be there, they might see exactly what kind of man my husband really was. Daniel turned off the lamp beside the bed. "You should get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we'll head home." But as I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of highway traffic, I couldn't stop thinking about that ceremony, about the stage, about the hundreds of people who would be there, and about the one person who still believed my husband's life amounted to babysitting for pennies. What I didn't know yet was that someone had already decided my father needed to see it with his own eyes. After everything that had happened over the weekend, the drive to Savannah felt strangely peaceful. Emma sat in the back seat, humming to herself, while she colored on a small notebook. Daniel drove with the same calm focus he always had. If he was nervous about the ceremony, he didn't show it. When we pulled into the parking lot of the Savannah Civic Center, I immediately realized something. This wasn't a small event. Cars filled almost every space. Teachers walked toward the entrance in groups. Parents carried flowers. Students held handmade posters. Inside the building, the auditorium was already buzzing with conversation. Rows of chairs stretched across the room. At least 300 people were there, maybe more. Emma squeezed my hand as we walked down the aisle. "Mommy," she whispered, "why are there so many people?" "Because a lot of people want to say thank you to your dad." Daniel disappeared backstage, with the other teachers being honored. Emma and I found seats near the front. A banner stretched across the stage. Chatham County Teacher of the Year. The ceremony began with a welcome from the superintendent. She spoke about education, about dedication, about the quiet work teachers do every day that most people never see. Then she began introducing the finalists. Each teacher received applause. Each one stood briefly for recognition. But when she reached the final name, the energy in the room shifted. And this year's Chatham County Teacher of the Year, she paused. Isas kuptimite. Anina tong. Mianao. Mr. Daniel Carter. The room exploded. People stood immediately. Students began cheering. Emma jumped up in her seat. That's my daddy. Daniel walked onto the stage, looking almost embarrassed by the attention. He accepted the plaque with a modest smile. But before he could speak, the superintendent raised her hand. We have a few people who asked to share something first. The first person who stepped to the microphone was a young man wearing a white medical coat. He looked nervous. He unfolded a small piece of paper. My name is Marcus Hill, he began. And 12 years ago, I was a junior at East Ridge High School. The audience grew quiet. Marcus took a breath. Most people at that time thought I wouldn't graduate. He glanced toward Daniel on stage. My mom had passed away, and I was sleeping in my car in the school parking lot. A ripple of whispers moved through the audience. I didn't tell anyone, Marcus continued. Except one person. He pointed toward Daniel. Mr. Carter. Marcus paused to steady his voice. He didn't report me. He didn't lecture me. He just showed up every morning and made sure I got to school. The room was completely silent now. He helped me fill out college applications. He paid for my exam fees when I couldn't afford them. And when I finally got accepted to Emory, Marcus smiled. He was the only adult sitting in the front row. Marcus folded the paper. Next year, I'll be finishing my residency as a doctor. He looked directly at Daniel. And the reason I'm standing here today is because one teacher believed I was worth saving. The audience rose to its feet again. Applause thundered through the auditorium. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. I turned slightly, and that's when I saw them. 3 rows behind us. My parents, my sister must have called them. My father sat stiffly in his chair, his expression unreadable. My mother had a tissue pressed to her face. On stage, Daniel stepped up to the microphone. He waited for the applause to fade. I'm not very good at speeches, he said modestly. Soft laughter moved through the room. But I do want to say something. He paused. This weekend, someone told me that teaching is basically babysitting teenagers for pennies. A few people chuckled politely. Daniel continued calmly. And you know what? They were right about one thing. The audience grew curious. I don't do this for the money. He looked out across the room. At the end of the day, the paycheck isn't what matters. He gestured gently toward Marcus. What matters is whether you show up when someone needs you. The room went completely still. Every student deserves at least one adult who believes in them. He smiled softly. I'm just grateful I get to be that person. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the entire auditorium stood again. 300 people clapping, students cheering, teachers smiling proudly. Emma wrapped her arms around my neck. That's my daddy, she whispered again. I glanced back once more. My father hadn't stood up, but for the first time in my life, Richard Whitaker looked like a man who didn't know what to say. Later, in the crowded lobby outside the auditorium, people lined up to congratulate Daniel. Parents shook his hand. Students hugged him. That's when my father finally walked over. He stood in front of Daniel, awkwardly for a moment. Then he cleared his throat. I didn't know about all this. Daniel looked at him calmly. You didn't ask. My father opened his mouth, but no words came out, because sometimes the most powerful answer in the world is silence. When you step back and look at this story, not just as a family conflict, but through the lens of human behavior, something very clear begins to appear. People like Richard often believe respect comes from power, from money, from status, from the size of the house you own, or the business card you hand someone. But over the years, psychologists and sociologists have studied something fascinating. The people who leave the deepest mark on a community are rarely the loudest or the richest. They are the ones who show up quietly, consistently, when no one is watching. Teachers, nurses, mentors, neighbors, people who invest their time in changing lives rather than impressing others. Daniel didn't defend himself that night at the dinner table. He didn't argue. He didn't try to prove his worth. And in many ways, that silence was the most powerful response of all. Because 2 days later, an entire community answered for him. And sometimes in life, that's how real respect works. It doesn't come from demanding recognition. It comes from earning it, one life at a time. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video and consider subscribing to the channel, because stories like this remind us of something many people forget in a world obsessed with money and titles. The true measure of a person is not what they earn, it's who they lift up along the way.